For over 600 years, one family ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. From the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the coasts of North Africa to the mountains of the Caucasus, the House of Osman commanded one of the most powerful dominions the world has ever seen. 36 sultans sat on the Ottoman throne. They built palaces that shimmered along the Bosphorus. They commanded armies that made European kings tremble. They held the title of caliph, meaning they were, at least in name, the spiritual leaders of the entire Sunni Muslim world. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire governed roughly 25 million people, controlled critical trade routes linking east and west, and projected a kind of power that seemed like it would last forever. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. Not just the empire. The family itself was erased from its own homeland, stripped of citizenship, stripped of property, stripped of the right to even pass through Turkey on a train. 156 members of the Ottoman dynasty were told to pack their bags, leave everything behind, and never come back. Princes trained for military command were suddenly homeless in foreign countries. Women who had never cooked a meal or handled their own money were washing dishes in European hotel kitchens just to survive. Former sultans died in borrowed villas, penniless and forgotten. Some family members literally searched through rubbish for food. This is one of the most dramatic falls from power in all of human history, and almost nobody talks about it. So let us go through exactly what happened to the Ottoman royal family after their empire collapsed, because the details are far more shocking, far more tragic, and far more fascinating than most people expect. To understand the exile, you first need to understand the collapse. And that collapse did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow, agonizing decline stretching across nearly a century before the final blow came. By the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire had already earned a grim nickname among European diplomats. They called it the sick man of Europe. The empire had been losing territory for decades. Russia kept chipping away at Ottoman lands in the north. France had seized Algeria. Britain was tightening its grip on Egypt. Greece, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, all of them broke free. The once mighty Ottoman military machine was being outpaced by the industrial armies of Western Europe. The sultans tried to reform. They genuinely tried. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century attempted to modernize the legal system, the military and education. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, tried to hold things together through autocratic control and strategic diplomacy. He invested in infrastructure, played European powers against each other, and used the caliphate as a tool of pan-Islamic unity. But it was not enough. The empire was hemorrhaging territory, drowning in debt owed to European banks, and struggling to keep its diverse population from tearing itself apart. Then came the Young Turks. In 1908, a group of military officers and intellectuals called the Committee of Union and Progress launched a revolution, forced Abdul Hamid to restore the constitution he had suspended, and a year later deposed him entirely. They installed his brother Mehmed V as a largely ceremonial sultan. They believed modernization and Turkish nationalism could save the empire. Instead, their ambitions dragged the Ottoman state into the catastrophe that would finally destroy it. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 stripped the empire of nearly all its remaining European territory. And then, in 1914, they made perhaps the single most consequential decision in Ottoman history. They entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a catastrophic gamble. British forces swept through Mesopotamia and Palestine. The Arab revolt peeled away Ottoman control over the Arabian Peninsula. By October 1918, the empire was finished. When Mehmed V died in July 1918, his younger brother Mehmed VI became the 36th and final sultan. He inherited not a throne of glory, but the wreckage of an empire. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. British, French, and Italian soldiers patrolled the streets of what had been the seat of Ottoman power for nearly 5 centuries. The Sultan's authority was reduced to almost nothing. But there was another force rising. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal was organizing the Turkish War of Independence. He gathered soldiers, rallied the population, and built a nationalist movement that rejected the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres, which the Allies had imposed in 1920 and which would have carved Turkey into pieces. By 1922, his forces had driven out the Greeks, pushed back the French and Italians, and effectively liberated what would become modern Turkey. But Kemal did not just want independence. He wanted a republic, a secular nation. And for that, the Sultanate had to go. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate. Sultan Mehmed VI suddenly found himself in an extraordinarily dangerous position. He was no longer Sultan. His government had been declared illegitimate. The nationalist movement viewed him as a collaborator with the occupying powers, and Ankara was talking about putting him on trial for treason. On November 17, 1922, he made his escape in British military ambulances, driven to the waterfront and escorted by a British general onto HMS Malaya, a massive British battleship. As the ship pulled away from Istanbul, he looked back at the city his ancestors had conquered and ruled for 469 years. He reportedly said his greatest sorrow was leaving his homeland. He would never see it again. The former sultan eventually settled in San Remo on the Italian Riviera. But the exile was not comfortable. His bank accounts were frozen. The wealth people assumed he possessed simply was not there. Ottoman sultans did not have personal fortunes the way European monarchs did. The treasury had belonged to the state, and the state had dissolved. He lived in a modest villa, spent his final years writing memoirs, and grew increasingly despondent. On the 16th of May, 1926, Mehmed VI died in his borrowed Italian villa at the age of 65. When they searched his belongings, they found that the man who had once commanded an empire spanning 3 continents had almost nothing to his name. He was buried in Damascus, far from the imperial tombs of Istanbul where his ancestors lay. But the truly devastating chapter came after he left, because Kemal was not finished. After abolishing the Sultanate, he had allowed the Caliphate to continue as a purely ceremonial institution. A cousin of the last sultan, named Abdülmecid II, was appointed caliph. He had no political power, but he was a deeply cultured man, a talented painter, a pianist, a polyglot. For about 16 months he served as caliph in Istanbul, holding weekly Friday processions, maintaining his dignity. But Kemal had no patience for any authority other than his own. When Abdülmecid wrote to the government requesting a modest increase in his allowance, Kemal's response was brutally dismissive. He told the caliph his office was a historic relic with no justification for existence. On March 3, 1924, the Grand National Assembly dropped the hammer. Deputies voted to abolish the caliphate entirely, expel every single member of the Ottoman royal family from Turkey, strip them of Turkish citizenship, and confiscate all their property. Abdülmecid did not even get the 3 days the law technically allowed. He was given hours to pack and rushed before dawn to a smaller train station because officials feared public demonstrations if people saw the caliph being deported. As the train pulled away, the last person to show any formal respect to the departing caliph was the Jewish director of the train station. A small gesture of humanity in a moment of profound cruelty. The law did not just affect the Sultan and the Caliph, it affected every single member of the dynasty. 156 people were officially listed for expulsion, but when you include family members who went voluntarily, servants who refused to abandon their masters, and children who had no choice, the actual number of exiles ran into the hundreds. These were people who had lived their entire lives within the glittering walls of Ottoman palaces. Many had never traveled abroad, many had never handled money, many had never done domestic work of any kind. They were trained in poetry, calligraphy, music, military strategy, and imperial protocol. None of that prepared them for what came next. Each family was given 1,000 Turkish lira upon departure, barely enough for travel expenses and perhaps a month of basic costs, and most of them did not even pack their entire belongings because they all believed sincerely that they would be coming home within a few months. This was just a temporary political situation. Surely it would blow over. It did not blow over. The exile lasted 30 years for the women and 50 years for the men. The families scattered across the world. Some went to France, where the largest concentration settled along the Riviera. Nice became an informal capital for the displaced dynasty. Others went to Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, and various European capitals. Abdul-Mesid, the last caliph, eventually settled in Nice. His financial situation improved somewhat when his daughter married the son of the Nizam of Hyderabad, considered one of the richest men in the world at the time, which provided a crucial financial lifeline. Abdul-Mesid spent his exile painting, playing piano, attending Friday prayers at the Grand Mosque of Paris, and writing memoirs that eventually filled 12 volumes. On August 23, 1944, he died of a heart attack in Paris as American troops fought to liberate the city from German occupation. Stray bullets from the street fighting reportedly flew into his villa. The last caliph of Islam died during the liberation of Paris. His family wanted to bury him in Istanbul. The Turkish government refused. His body remained at the mortuary of the Grand Mosque of Paris for nearly a decade before finally being buried in Medina, Saudi Arabia, the city where the institution of the caliphate had been born 13 centuries earlier. But the caliph was actually one of the luckier members of the family. For the rest, exile was an exercise in humiliation and survival that is almost impossible to comprehend. By 1925, most members of the family were effectively stateless. Their Turkish travel documents expired after 1 year and could not be renewed, since they were no longer citizens. They could not legally travel, they could not work in most countries, they were trapped wherever they happened to be. The financial situation was catastrophic. These were people who had grown up donating to charity, not receiving it. The men had no marketable skills in the civilian economies of 1920s Europe. The women, many of whom had never left the palace grounds, were completely unprepared for independent life. Some sold their jewelry to survive, underselling precious pieces because they had no idea what things were worth, and buyers knew they were desperate. When the jewelry ran out, the real suffering began. There are documented accounts of members of the Ottoman royal family washing dishes in hotels, begging for money on the streets, and searching through rubbish for something to eat. Some literally died of hunger. A trustee assigned to sell the family's remaining properties in Turkey betrayed them, spending the proceeds on himself and leaving the exiled dynasty with nothing. The world was not particularly sympathetic. Europe in the 1920s and 1930s had its own problems, recovering from the First World War, dealing with the rise of fascism, navigating economic depression. A displaced Ottoman royal family was a curiosity, not a cause. Some Muslim rulers around the world sent money, but the family was so scattered that much of this aid never reached the people who needed it most. There is one particularly haunting detail about the last Sultan's exile in San Remo. King Victor Emmanuel III reportedly offered him palaces to live in and a steady income. The Sultan refused. As an Islamic leader, he considered it unacceptable to accept support from a non-Muslim sovereign. He chose poverty over what he saw as a compromise of his dignity. He kept the imperial signet and a heavy gold dynastic necklace, refusing to sell them despite his desperate circumstances. He valued what he represented more than his own comfort, and he carried that burden until the day he died. While most of the family suffered in obscurity, some members carved out remarkable lives despite everything. Princess Neslishah Sultan was born in 1921, just 2 years before the Republic was proclaimed, the granddaughter of both the last Sultan and the last Caliph, and the final entry in the official palace registry before sovereignty was abolished. She was only 3 years old when expelled. She grew up in Nice, later married an Egyptian prince, and experienced the fall of a second dynasty when Egypt's monarchy was overthrown in 1952. She spent her later years preserving Ottoman history and cultural traditions, passing away in Istanbul in 2012 at the age of 91, the last person whose birth was recorded in the Imperial registry. In 1952, 28 years after the expulsion, Turkey finally allowed female members of the dynasty to return. The men had to wait until 1974, a full 50 years after the exile began. By then, most of the original exiles were dead. Those who came back returned to a country utterly transformed. Their properties were gone. Their social position was gone. Turkey had spent half a century defining itself in opposition to the Ottoman past. The family adopted the surname Osmanoğlu, meaning son of Osman. Today, the family numbers several dozen living descendants scattered across Turkey, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. The fall of the Ottoman dynasty was not just a family tragedy, it was a geopolitical earthquake still reverberating today. The borders drawn by European diplomats carving up Ottoman Arab territories created the framework for many conflicts still plaguing the Middle East. The abolition of the caliphate created a spiritual vacuum that has never been filled, and the concept of a restored caliphate became central to the ideology of extremist groups in the 21st century. The ghost of the institution Kemal destroyed continues to haunt global politics. In recent decades, Turkey has experienced a dramatic Ottoman revival. Television dramas about the Ottoman era became massive hits across the Middle East and globally. The empire, once portrayed as a cautionary tale, has been repackaged as a golden age. The Osmanoğlu family, after decades of being persona non grata in their own homeland, is now treated with cautious respect. They appear on television programs and are invited to cultural events. But they have no political power and no claim to any throne. They are ordinary citizens with an extraordinary surname. The palaces their ancestors built are museums open to anyone who buys a ticket. There is something deeply human about this story that goes beyond politics. It is about what happens when power is not just lost, but actively stripped away. About people who went from commanding millions to searching through rubbish bins. About dignity in the face of destitution. About identity when everything that defined you has been taken away. No other royal family in modern history experienced anything quite like this. The Romanovs were killed. The Habsburgs lost their empire but kept some wealth and status. The Ottomans were systematically erased from their own nation's story, exiled, impoverished, and forgotten, only to slowly re-emerge decades later as the world began to reckon with what had been lost. Disclaimer: this video is created purely for educational and informational purposes only. The views and interpretations expressed here are based on information gathered from publicly available sources, including YouTube, Google, news outlets, and general historical research. This content does not claim to be a definitive or academic account of the events described. Viewers are encouraged to conduct their own research and consult professional historians for deeper study of these topics.